Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from Alex Ray, I'm talking about the 2009 album from Wisp, We Miss You.
We love you, Dad.
Okay, Wisp is the alias for one Reed W. Dunn, an IDM artist from Niagara Falls. He'd been around a while before this album dropped. I haven't heard any of his other releases, but this project was released on the one and only Reflex record label way back in 2009, and apparently attained a pretty decent cult following since. It is a pretty interesting mix. In one breath, it very much follows the ethos of what I would typically associate with the term IDM. Glitchy, fast-paced breaks and synth melodies with lots of strange shifting rhythms and a focus on density of sound design. Not to mention the tone of these breaks and beats does sort of recall the late 90s and early 2000s. Stuff like the Richard D. James album and Square Pushers Go Plastic. But it also has a much more pleasant, laid-back, and melody-centric approach to its mix, perhaps like artists like Tipper have explored. And especially Ulrich Schnaus, the tones of many of the synth melodies here feel similar to a project like Faraway Trains Passing By, albeit much glitchier and more detailed as I mentioned. I've heard people say this project evokes the world of J.R.R. Tolkien for them. I'm told some of the modulated spoken word passages on a few tracks are taken from his Silmarillion novel. The kind of project that evokes some strange fantasy world that can feel more detached from society and put you out in the wilderness. Definitely an interesting idea behind it, and a feel to it that's not quite like any other project out there. As for myself, I do generally think this album is good, very well crafted and produced, and letting all these various sounds flying by you get their own space in the mix. I definitely have to appreciate for how much work clearly went into it and how well executed it turned out to be. I kinda wish I could get more enthusiastic about it beyond that, though. Look, my issues with this project are not at all complicated. At the end of the day, I really only have one complaint with it, but it is one that really got in the way. This project is very samey. The vibe and attention to detail may be well done across the board, but the fact that I can barely tell most of these tracks apart from each other is a big knock against it. The whole thing just blends together in a giant incoherent blur for me, even sometimes when I, paid close attention to it. And this sameness could unfortunately also lead to the vibe itself growing stale, when any of the tracks taken completely out of context would still hit perfectly fine. I just often feel like I'm being cycled through really similar ideas over and over. If the vibe of this album is to get me lost in an enchanted forest, then it's the variety of forest in which I'm running towards nothing again and again and again and again, as they say. This project can be great for me in short bursts. I bet if I were to cut it down to like an EP length of just my personal favorite tracks, then I'd have a listening experience I could have more fun coming back to. The way it is now, though, it's a project that feels like it loses its magic through much of the middle stretch if I don't give it my absolute unbroken attention. And I often come out sick of the sound if I go through all of it in one sitting. And this album's only 75 minutes, that's really not that long. It should be a perfectly reasonable length for one sitting, though it doesn't seem to bother most people that I've seen, so I don't know what the deal is with me. In case you couldn't tell, I'm pretty conflicted about this one. I've seen quite a few people mark this project as among their favorites of all time, and I definitely get where those people are coming from, and understand how they'd get into it so much more than I did. But I still wish I could share that level of excitement myself. I merely think it's pretty good and not truly great. Now, that's definitely not to say this thing doesn't still have plenty of great moments. The opener, Morning Myth, is a really strong beginning to this project. Its lead video game synth melodies seem to pierce through the mix like smoothed out harpsichords, going over washes of ambient pads and banging breaks. And I love all the various change-ups the track goes through, especially when it just kicks into high gear like the 2.5 minute mark. Even when this project still mostly offers variations on the exact same mixes of glitchy synths and whatever else as seen on the opener, this first track has remained consistently exciting every time I put it on. I thought the simultaneously gentle and hard-hitting drill and bass mixes going over expansive video game MIDI synths on trees-like toys were very nice. Some of the synth textures kind of reminded me of Plone, had the same playful and uplifting feeling to it that some of their stuff does, albeit not nearly as goofy. The track Uriollach was one of my least favorite moments on here when I first heard this thing, but really grew on me a lot with each successive listen, especially these kind of wubbing bass licks that almost kind of sound like voices. and the way the mix builds up into some nice, pleasant trip-hop beats a la Sissid's Trishesla, I guess, and various other glitchy breakdowns that would pop in at various intervals. And the album went out strongly as well. There's a whole bunch of solid highlights right near the end, like the super fast-paced and energetic rush of lords and ladies that would always wake me up more than previous tracks. I thought Moss on Stone was one of the absolute best ones. That had a bunch of different sections that all flowed together great, from some ambient excursions to sections that sounded almost like lo-fi hip-hop, to like synth imitation orchestral strings, and then this crazy build-up into the most fast-paced breakbeat run of the whole album. Great stuff all around. And of course the closer, In the Offing, was a solid way to go out as well, with its super unpredictable switch-ups that can happen sometimes in mid-beat and make me feel like I'm tuning through some IDM radio stations or something. Pretty creative stuff. Other tracks on here would have cool moments, like that part in Pogo Nip where the whole mix switches over into like this acid breakdown straight out of Square Pusher's Big Loda era, the odd, oily, Boards of Canada-esque melodies on Myriad that were easier to recognize with every passing listen, or the somewhat more delicate trip-hop-ish atmosphere created on We Are Like You. That one is super Ulrich Schnauz-ish. I think that whole mix was also done in a better and more original way on Uriollach, but whatever. But other tracks like To Draw Something Beautiful, Happy Sneakers, and Bottoms Up Charlie Longfeet that would have the same mixes of delicate and uplifting melodies and atmosphere with breakbeats of varying tempos and energy. All this kinds of stuff just tend to blend to the background. The former of those three especially just sounding like a bunch of cuts left over from the Richard D. James album strung together. And the latter was a pretty frequent point at which I would kind of start to feel tapped out with the whole album's vibe, despite the track title, which, you know, sticks out when you look over this thing. Bottoms Up Charlie Longfeet? You'd think that would imply something more interesting and engaging than what we got. There are also two entirely ambient cuts to break up the pacing that I could appreciate. For Thistles grew a bunch of melancholy ambient pads and low-key flutes out of some super low-mix field recordings and created some really effective emotional atmosphere, even if it totally threw me off when I listened to this thing while running errands in the car, since the entire first half came up completely silent. But when I would sit up and pay attention to it, that was quite nice. The other mostly ambient cut, Fading on Tape, admittedly wasn't as crazy about. It was mostly some, like, formless, gurgling electric piano ramblings that were pleasant enough, but didn't really stick out to me. I mean, overall, this is a pretty tough project to quantify. In one breath, I definitely understand how this got so much hype. First, given the fact that it is so overlooked and feels like you were just finding this undiscovered gem that no one's ever heard. And it is super well produced, has great attention to detail, is fairly unique in the IDM world, and just manages to stand out in the crowd while pleasing any longtime fans of artists like Aphex Twin and Boards of Canada and all those guys. And I will say, for me personally, the project did get a little better with every listen, peaking when I was most awake and could give it my full attention and be able to soak in how heavily detailed everything is. But I've also listened to this thing like 6 times, and 4 or 5 of those listens landed in the 6 range of personal enjoyment. And at no point would I say this thing crossed over into the 8 range for me as a whole, like mid-high 7 at the very highest. And as unique as it may technically be, the vast majority of sound design elements in this project directly remind me of other IDM artists I've already known for years. Wisp is only barely carving out his own lane, and I feel like his influences are still really obvious, even if he's not, like, directly stepping on any of their toes. This could get more of an emotional reaction than, say, Tipper's Jettison Mind Hatch, but I also felt that guy's sound design was more out of the box and the kind of thing you could call his own. And both that project and this one similarly got that somewhat underwhelmed reaction of, I understand every take from people who think this is one of the greatest of all time, but man, I wish I were personally more into it myself. I mean, honestly, I don't think this is the kind of thing I'm going to be hanging on to long term, but I can definitely give it my recommendation to anyone else. Like Jettison Mind Hatch, I am clearly in the minority when it comes to finding this project only good and not great. Most people I've seen think it's amazing, so who knows, maybe you'll give it a shot and it'll end up clicking with you way more than it did for me. Even if I'm probably not hanging on to it, I did generally like it, and can say it did get much better when I could give it my full attention. So, I don't know, I guess take that all as you will. This guy does not have nearly the same size of cult following that Tipper does. He's fairly overlooked and could probably stand some more attention. So, if this all sounds interesting to you, give him a shot. I think I'm overall feeling a very light 7.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, the link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.